Welcome to this webinar organized by Azapo Limpopo. On the 25th of April, 1974, the military dictatorship in Portugal expired through peaceful protests in Lisbon and other cities. 6 months later was the scheduled nominal takeover of FRELIMO in Mozambique, of MPLA in Angola, and the other Portuguese colonies on the continent. The Black consciousness organizations led by BPC and SASO decided to celebrate the advent of freedom with our immediate neighbor, Mozambique. While Angola was also a neighbor because Namibia, then Southwest Africa, was run by Pretoria. The fact is that we shared a common language and we shared an immediate history of liberation with FRELIMO in Mozambique. And the decision taken by the leadership of SASO and BPC was that we should call this the Viva FRELIMO Rally, that would be held in all the centers where we had a significant presence. The rallies were announced on Sunday, the 22nd of September, in the weekend press, and sense of electric anticipation gripped the country. On the one hand, the Black majority felt exhilarated, and on the other, the white minority felt exceedingly threatened. The very next day, militia threatened to stop the rallies if the government didn't step in. So that evening, the Monday evening, the government announced, the apartheid government announced that that all the rallies were banned. Muntu Myeza issued a joint statement on behalf of SASO and BPC, saying, "We are not aware of any banning. Even if there were, the will of the people shall not be suppressed by a foreign settler minority regime." And so the path was set for uncertainty, excitement, exhilaration, and confrontation. As it turned out, on the very morning of the 25th of September, the government gazette was printed, which banned all the rallies. That evening, that afternoon in Turfloop, that evening in Curry's Fountain, in various other places where people attempted to gather, because we did not have social media, we did not have television or radio that we could announce the banning through. It was only the print media, and the broadcaster was a state broadcaster. It broadcast only what the government wanted. So from that afternoon and continuing for a few weeks thereafter, various SASO BPC leaders, as well as other activists, were arrested. All of them, all of us, were transported to Pretoria, and because Pretoria local prison could not take all of us, some were detained in various police stations near Pretoria, as far away as Brits and Vlakplaas. Amongst the accused were, besides Muntu Myeza and myself, Patrick Lekota, Aubrey Mokoape, Nkwenkwe Nkomo, Zithulele Cindi, Strinivasa Moodley, and our two panelists today, Pandelani Nefolovhodwe, whom you know as a past president of AZAPO, and Kaborone KK, popularly known as KK Sedibe. Our trial started on the 31st of January, 1975. That evening at about 6:30, we were brought to a special session of the Magistrates' Court in Pretoria, and 13 of us were arraigned. It's significant that when the case was called, it was called in Afrikaans. And even though there were only 3 of us who really didn't study Afrikaans, that was Strinivasa Moodley, Sivalingam Moodley, and myself. We didn't do Afrikaans in school at all. Immediately, Pandelani Nefolovhodwe, the whole lot of the accused, started saying, we want a translator because we don't understand Afrikaans. And the proceedings had to be stopped. They had to get a translator to come in. Can you imagine that most of us are detained from the 25th of September, 1974. We brought to the Magistrates' Court on the 31st of January. And all of us are in our early to mid-20s. 1 or 2 were slightly older. But from that point, without members of the public present, with only the system there, the magistrate, the court officials, the prosecutor, and security policemen, we want an interpreter. So proceedings had to be adjourned for about half an hour while they found an interpreter, because it was after hours anyway. Meanwhile, Ismael Ayub was present. How he got there was a mystery to us, and we interrogated him on how he happened to be in the magistrate's court. And he gave us different reasons, saying, he was called. Somebody said, well, Shan Chetty is our attorney. He said, well, he's been in touch with him, etc., etc. Eventually, somebody said amongst the accused, it must be the system, the SBs, who called you. And he acknowledged that it was the SBs who called him to be our attorney. So after 4 months in solitary confinement, after brutal torture, after much aggression by security policemen, we adopt the attitude that we want to control our trial on the very first remand date. And thus it is that the entire trial proceeded on the basis that the accused, 13 initially, Nomsisi Krai, Kuzwayo was added as the 14th, and then months later in 75, charges against all the others were withdrawn, and the 9 SASO BPC remained as the accused. Throughout that trial, except for finer legal points, we determined the pace of that trial. So it was that we planned that Steve Biko would be our opening defense witness. Steve, being Steve, decided to take 2 weeks to drive from King Williamstown to Pretoria and didn't arrive on the day that the case was supposed to have started at the beginning of April. So we had a second witness, Rick Turner, who was one of the NUSAS 8 that was banned at the same time that the SASO BPC 8 were banned at the beginning of 1973. February 28th, 1973, there were 8 SASO BPC leaders banned, as well as NUSAS leaders. He was one of those. So Rick Turner then became our first witness. It was important for us to also present this notion that certain people within the establishment, especially the media, and amongst sections of the liberation movement who understood Black consciousness to be anti-white and a chauvinism. It was important for us to dispel that myth that being pro yourself automatically entailed being anti somebody else. So Rick Turner testified, and still no Steve. Bishop Manaps Buthelezi testified, still no Steve. And then I had entered the witness box on the 12th of April. My stay in the witness box was for 3 weeks. And of course, on the second day or so of my testimony, Steve trots into court. His testimony has been made legend by the testimony of Steve Biko. But let me say right at the outset that the testimony of each of the accused, in their mid to late 20s by the time we testified, make for riveting drama and reading. It's a pity that AZAPO, for instance, and the Black consciousness organizations have not thought it appropriate to publish the testimonies of Zithulele Cindi, Secretary General of AZAPO now, Pandelani Nefolovhodwe, past president, and so on and so on, because that would give you an intimate understanding of who these leaders were and are, and the context in which we came to the fore after the PAC engaged in the peaceful anti-pass campaign on the 21st of March 1960. The following month, Vervoet bans both the PAC and the ANC. Then we have Mkhonto weSizwe declaring itself on the 16th of December 1961. We have the Rivonia trial, and then spasmodically trials happening of people infiltrating into the country. But until the advent of SASO, a pall of fear had engulfed the entire community. And the reason I'm giving this background is that it's important that even within you in AZAPO, in the main, you probably don't have a full understanding of that signal history, that people in their early 20s would decide to challenge the might of the most militarist state on the southern tip of the African continent. The most virulent forms of racism, arguably after Hitler Germany imposed itself on our people and kept them apart. Effectively, then, this trial was Black consciousness on trial. Somebody said to me 2 days ago, not a stone had been lifted or thrown, and that's true. It was for the ideology of Black consciousness, that project of conscientization, and that affinity with FRELIMO right next door, saying viva to them on accession to power, that put the system against the wall. And for that, we knew we were going to get convicted. I should say right at the outset that at the end of February 1976, before the defense trial started, the state was still concluding its evidence. Kenny Rachidi, who was president of AZAPO, Tiza Mazibuko, who was president of BPC, sorry, Tiza Mazibuko, who was secretary general of the BPC, Drake Coker, who had been the coordinator of the ad hoc committee to form BPC, Tom Mantata, who'd been in that ad hoc committee, Aubrey Mokoena, Seth Mazibuko, and a few others visited the 9 of us in Pretoria prison. And after our customary greetings, you know how we spend time with our handshakes and hugs and so on, Kenny and Tom and Drake raised that something big was brewing in Soweto as a result of the forcible imposition of Afrikaans. The worry they had was that if this blows up, we would be convicted. Immediately we said, we were in leadership, but now you are. The struggle continues. So I'm raising this because there's all sorts of myth about the nexus between what happened in June 16th and the Black consciousness period. But here were leaders, some of them alive, who can verify that that actually did happen. With that background in mind, our trial ended with our being convicted, as we knew we would be. And on the 21st of December, 1976, all of us were sentenced to either a minimum 5 years on, a minimum of 5 years on each count. And that resulted in Muntu Myeza, Zithulele Cindi, Aubrey Mokoape, Nkwenkwe Nkomo, Pandelani Nefolovhodwe, Kaborone Sedibe, Zithulele Cindi, Strinivasa Moodley, and myself being sent to Robben Island. The very next day, we were transported via the death row cells and then arrived in Robben Island on the 23rd of December, almost on the eve of Christmas, 1976. There were Black consciousness activists already in Robben Island, notably Musibudi Mangena, former president of AZAPO, SCAP, Nkwenkwe Nkomo, various others from the Eastern Cape, but the biggest number comprised the SASO BPC 9, as well as young students from UWC. I'm going to now call on Pandelani Nefolovhodwe to give you a glimpse from his perspective of what happened in Robben Island. Over to you, Pandelani.
Yeah, thank you, Saths. When we arrived, we were immediately taken to a section which is meant as an observation section to observe so that when you finish your observation, they can then determine where you should be taken for purposes of serving your sentence. But then we found also comrades from UWC who were also with us in that section. And finally, we were all taken to a section which was specifically meant for what was referred to as the people of the Swart Gevaar, which was a section for people who participated in June 16, which is a section there. If you go to Robben Island, it's a section E. And we stayed there, and they then, in their own way of wanting us to be subjected to their power, they took us, amongst others, to the quarry to go and work there. But being ourselves, we had told ourselves that no, we are not going to kowtow. We were going to show them that we are political prisoners and we are not supposed to be subjected to hard labor. So all sorts of things happened there. We would be working sometimes very slowly, And the warder who was looking after us, he would want to shout at us, but we were what you may refer to as uncontrollable. And some fights ensured. And a dog was put on us. We had some of our guys ended up being charged. But finally, that whole fighting, toing and froing with them ended up with us fighting them even when we were in ourselves. You see, the tendency of coming to visit us from time to time, sometimes being drunk and wanting us to stand up and shout at us and say, Makfasio Baiki. Still, the fight was on. And finally, they realized that they could not control these Black consciousness fellows. They decided to build a special place for the Black consciousness movement leadership. And that was built with speed. There is a section on Robben Island which is called Section A. It was built with speed and walls were put all over so that when you are in that section, you cannot be able to even see where the other sections are. You are isolated by being in your cell, but if you are outside your cell, you cannot see any further than the walls that were surrounding you. That was the way in which they interpreted our resolve to continue to fight them even in prison. So a section was built and we were all taken there. And then Comrade Saths Cooper and Comrade KK, as he's popularly referred to, and Zithulele Cindi were taken to Section B, which was a section where all the political leadership were staying. That is PAC, SWAPO, and the ANC, as well as the unity movement leaders were staying in that section. So Comrade Saths and Comrade KK and Comrade Zithulele Cindi were separated from the rest of us. We were then taken to Section A. But with the times of interaction with the system, as we called it, it became very clear to them that if those who were in Section A and those who were in Section B were not different. And at one stage or the other, they decided to say, well, the two sections must be allowed to mix. And finally, we were allowed to visit each other, particularly on weekends. The section that housed the political leadership of the PAC, the ANC, SWAPO, and us who were in the section referred to as Section A, we were allowed to mix. By that time, we had already been joined by some of the comrades that we found on Robben Island who were serving life sentences for one reason or the other. After a long, long time, they were then brought to stay with us in Section A. So as time went on, we were able now to to discuss political issues with the leadership of the ANC, the leadership of the PAC, and SWAPO was represented by only one person, which is Toivo Jatoivo. And we found a lot of differences of interpretation of the struggle when we were mixing with this leadership. Even the leadership themselves, one by one, they didn't believe entirely in the same things that many people believe they did. For just to give you an example, Govan Mbeki had his own interpretation, completely different from that of Mandela. And he would be able to tell you that no, he doesn't agree with Mandela on many issues. But this is not the platform on which I'm going to discuss that. We then also stayed in section A with the MK fellows who were one by one coming after 1976. Some of them ended up in section A, the likes of Gwala and an old man called Kaba, who's popularly known as Mfenendal. So we also interacted with them, and we found that Comrade Gwala didn't actually like Mandela completely, because he felt that Mandela was compromising the struggle of our people. And we ourselves, at that stage, we had also reached a conclusion that the way in which particularly Mandela and the other comrades were looking at the future of our country was not what the Black consciousness movement would have loved our country to be. And that is today very, very clear, that their interpretation of a free and democratic country
Yeah, that's fine.
It is not the same country that we and Steve Biko envisaged. So it's very clear that quite from the days of our trial, we were clear that here we are together in prison, yes. We are political prisoners together, yes. But we were convinced that the outcome of the struggle, if it was led by the other fellows and ourselves, would not be the same at all. And today I'm convinced, as I talk now, that we were right. So, but prison is prison. When we were in prison, the kinds of things that we were able to see already as some compromises was that in prison, when you enter, you are designated Group D. And as you behave according to their own rules, they would promote you from that D to C, from C to B, and from B to A. And these categories, they go with your privileges. How many letters you should receive, and the niceties that you may also get. You could buy certain things that other prisoners are not allowed to buy. And that question became a conflict area between ourselves and the older prisoners we found in prison, because by that time, some of them had already been classified A, in which case they were receiving privileges as a group. And we had decided as the Black Consciousness Movement in prison that we were not going to allow the establishment to divide us on the basis of who gets what privilege. So we then had a policy that if you belong to us and you're part of the Black Consciousness Movement in prison, you would be Group D right through up until the day your sentence is over. And that we succeeded in doing. And now it meant that when Comrade Saths and Comrade Zit and Comrade KK, who were staying with the older prisoners in that section B, it meant that when they buy their niceties and other things and offer them, there were instances where our comrades would say, no, thank you. We have a policy which says we don't want to be classified, and therefore we don't want to be enjoying privileges backdoor. And that caused a lot of tension between us and the other leadership. Also, our attitude in prison was quite different, because we maintained that we will continue to behave the same way as we did when we were waging the struggle. For instance, we will raise our clenched fist very high whenever we meet other prisoners. Didn't matter which prisoner was it. And that was not allowed by the system in prison. But we defied it, and up until it was allowed. But still, the behavior of the older prisoners, I think they had been subjected to real danger. But some of them would not raise the fist when we raise it. And to our other young comrades, it became a sore point where they had to question the older prisoners as to why are you not doing these things, even when we had succeeded to make the system to agree. Now, that is just really a general view of what transpired between us and the other prisoners, and what transpired between us and the system. We harassed the system in as much as it wanted to harass us, up until they had to create a section where they thought they would control us, but we remain what we were. So let me leave it there, and KK will take talk about other things later.
Thank you, Nef. Kaborone Sedibe was the president of the SRC at the time that the Viva FRELIMO rallies were scheduled to happen. And I'm going to hand over to him now to give you his perspective and his take on issues, other issues in Robben Island. Over to you, KK.
Thank you, Comrade Saths. It's unfortunate that my camera can't be connected. However, I think you and Comrade Nef have dealt with the issues that need to be attended to. And some of the points that I need to make are as follows. We had never really wanted to inquire what Robben means, but the word Robben is the Dutch word that in English means a seal, an animal that we find in the sea. Now, I always say to people we were delivered like parcels. Like when you deliver a parcel from a factory to a shop, we were delivered just like that to Robben Island. The point has been made by the facilitator that we were just after our conviction, whilst we were still waiting that maybe over the weekend we would see our families, we were taken unceremoniously through a truck driven over a period of 24 hours from Pretoria to Robben Island, really to the Cape Town docks. When we arrived there at the dock in order to be taken to Robben Island by the ferry, Comrade Nchaupe didn't want to actually make us to feel very nervous and start maybe fighting. He just on his own said, I want to see the doctor. The doctor checked him and found that his blood pressure was very high. He wanted to create that evidence because we would need it in future. Now, a point I need to say about the trial, it has been properly dealt with already, is that the defense witnesses were, their evidence was totally rejected by the judge, a chap called Judge Boshoff. He rejected it on the basis that they are people who work with us, then they are bound to defend us. And that's where it ended. Very good people who came to defend us, like for instance, the late Dr. Manas Buthelezi, they came there, but their evidence was just rejected in one sentence. Now, when we arrived on Robben Island, Comrade Neff has already hinted at the point that we went to the observation section. The 9 of us were joined by the comrades from the University of the Western Cape, Paul Plaikis, Owen Stearman, Bertie Gonsalves, etc. That very observation section is a section where Zafendas was kept. Zafendas who made that Verwoerd in 1966. But of interest as well there is that we met a gentleman. He was a convicted, but we don't know really what happened to him. A Comrade Zwane. He used to talk with Nchaupe all the time, and he used to say, "Guys, we must just go on." That guy, we don't know how he landed here. He was apparently taken away from Robben Island, but it's an issue that needs to be followed as to where he ended up being taken to. Now, after the so-called observation, we were taken to E section, which came really to be what we call the Klep-Hoyers section. At E section, we met all the militant army of freedom fighters from South Africa. You name any place in South Africa, you'd find an activist that came from those areas. Militancy needs to be shown in action. And the place where we collected our food from the main kitchen at the gate. When you were at the gate, you could see the main kitchen and the other comrades from the other sections, section and G. You would see them queuing there to collect their food. And as we went to the gate of the section to collect the food, we would raise our fist and say, "Amandla!" The warders, of course, would try to stop us, would just carry on. We carried on and until they decided, no, let's give up, let's leave these guys, let them grieve as they wish. And that was a sign of the militancy of the guys. That in spite of the fact that they were claphoyers outside and they were now in prison, they could never really be controlled by the system. Now, the raising of the Black Power salute really made the prison authorities mad. There are many, some of the comrades from the E section would be called to the administration to do something. They would see some of the prisoners on prison and raise the Black Power salute. Those some of our comrades on prison actually would run away from raising the Black Power salute. The experience that Comrade Nef has talked about at the quarry, it's important to relate. We were digging at the quarry where most of the prisoners had actually also worked. But as we were digging, it became a very deep cave. And one day we said to the warders, no, we cannot continue digging there. It's dangerous. This cave is going to fall and bury us alive. And we refused to work. And then they set the dogs on us. And then we said we are not working. And then we're taken back to the prison. And then some of us were charged for that incident. Comrade Saths Cooper, Comrade Muntu Myeza, Comrade Bertie Gonsalves, Comrade Owen Stearman, Paul Blakes, myself, Strinivasa Moodley were charged. We were 9 of us, but then we won the case because the commander of the prison was called to the witness box to give evidence that we defied a lawful command. But the advocate that we had, who was working hand in hand with Dula Omar as the instructing attorney, the advocate was Advocate Falam. They put it to this commanding officer that actually he did not give us a lawful command because he was not there at the quarry. And on that basis, the regional magistrate agreed with our argument that we never defied a lawful command, technically in terms of the law. By the way, we had asked Comrade Saths to go into the box to give evidence on our behalf. Now, once they had lost hello? Once they had lost the case, they became very hostile to us, and they tried to discipline us in many ways. Comrade Nef has already alluded to the fact that we were taken to various sections. It was a way of trying to say, let's move the BC people from various other sections, let them be together so that they can influence one another, but let's move them away from the other people. Now, around 78, early 78 or late 77, we were informed by the ANC that K.D. Matanzima had asked that he wanted to release, he wanted the comrades from Transkei to be released. And then we were requested by the ANC for an opinion. And we said, of course, that can never happen because the Transkei is part of the apartheid regime. It's just a trick to try to divide the struggle outside by the people. Fortunately, the ANC people agreed to that view, which in any case was supported was supported by other organizations like the Unity Movement. Now, Nef has talked about the groupings in prison. We discussed this issue variously, and in particular with the International Committee of the Red Cross. We told them that because you always come here as a link between us and the authorities of the prison, please tell them that we do not want to be grouped. What the system must do is that automatically a person who comes into prison must just enjoy the privileges which they call by everyone. Every prisoner who comes, every person who comes on Robben Island must enjoy the privileges of an A prisoner. Of course, they refused. And then we never agreed that we would be graded. So that some of us, even after 10 years, they still left Robben Island, the BC people as D prisoners. We were at one stage as well visited by Helen Suzman. Helen Suzman, will remember, was a member of the Progressive Party in Parliament. She visited Robben Island, and we were then, myself and Comrade Seth and Comrade Zit, staying in B section. When we were told that Helen Suzman is around to visit us, we told the warders, myself, Seth, and Zit, that we are not going to meet Helen Suzman. And we said, they said, okay, because she's going to be coming to the cells, we don't want her to see you sitting in the cells. We said, okay, we'll go down to the area where we play some games. We went there. When we were sitting there, myself, Comrade Z and Comrade Saths, the head of the prison sent a sergeant who came to warn us that we must come and meet Helen Suzman. Otherwise, if we don't come and meet Helen Suzman, they are going to take away our privileges. So we decided, okay, this is not worth it really. Let's just go and see her. So we found that she was already with the other prisoners in the tennis court, greeting them, etc., etc. But then it's worthy of note that practically, as people who did, as BC activists who did not believe that Helen Suzman could anything for the struggle, should come in prison and come and meet people who are trying to overthrow the regime. She was not part of fighting the system. By the way, we hear from time to time people saying Steve Biko is an anti-apartheid activist. Steve Biko, just like all the BC people, are not anti-apartheid activists. We are freedom fighters. Because if you are an anti-apartheid activist, it means you are just concerned with removing the structure of apartheid. But as the judge in the SASO BPC case had said, the problem with Black consciousness is that you do not want to change a little bit here and there. You want to overthrow the whole superstructure. And we said to him, yes, that's what we want. And that's why actually he convicted us. So even in prison, we felt that a person like Helen Suzman should never really be given that opportunity to come and shake hands with us. Now, I'm sure we will, comrade the facilitator, stop really at that point, because then there may be people who want to ask questions, etc.
Thank you very much, KK. I think it's important to also just point out a few things so that all of you get an idea of what this prison was about. There were single cell sections right next to the administration block, and then there were open cells. These were H block cells, like a capital H with a passage in between. There were 4 cells, and those cells ideally ought to have had 30 prisoners in them. But from 77 right through to 79, the prison was overcrowded. Just as in the mid 60s, when that prison was originally built, more sections were put in, and what KK referred to as the Klipgooier section or the Swartmag section was intended to keep the Black consciousness activists separate from the rest of the prison. What began to happen very quickly in January 77 was walls got built between the different sections. So what previously was just a fence between those sections and sort of walkways in between, or passages for the warders to move between the one section and the other, then had walls around them. And those walls were intended purely to keep the rebellious 76 youth locked up, because we were regarded as a virus that would infect the rest of the prison. And some of the examples given are critical ones, where we found that the prison was as quiet as a graveyard. There was no singing, no engagement. And in that single cell section, the famous B section, where you have the Rivonia Trialists and some of us and various other prisoners there. On the 21st of March 1978, we held a Sharpeville vigil or commemoration. And sad to say, we held it almost alone, with 1 or 2 speakers, a PAC speaker and so on. But generally, other organizations didn't participate because people were used to being on their own and doing things for themselves, but not in a communal way. Fairly quickly in our imprisonment, after the isolation and then the the section, the D section, the name, the name changed from E to D and D to E and so on. But this Swartmag section, when we were moved there, it was one where we engaged with the warders. We called them Bavarder or warder. But the older prisoners would use the word meneer. So when we engaged with them in the single cells, very intense discussions happened over the use of the word meneer. The unity movement guys would trace it back to mein Herr from the German and so on. And we'd say, we understand all of that. But basically, if you say meneer on its own and don't say meneer Nefolovhodwe, you are saying sir. And we are not going to say sir to any oppressor. There were also contestations about whether these were workers or these were oppressors. And we said very clearly, they may be working at a certain level, but they were part of the oppressive infrastructure. So there are critical examples like that to show that the spirit of young people, Black consciousness, infested the prison. Last night there was a documentary on the making of Mandela. It's a Discovery Channel documentary. And in it, and I'll try to quote Mandela quite accurately. He says the youth changed the prison, meaning all of us who came in there after 76. They hated white supremacy from the bottom of their hearts. Compared to them, we were moderates. Now, another important event, very critical, that happened was that recruitment began to happen from the ANC into Black consciousness. Now, I know this is not spoken of too much, but last month, Sibusiso Ndebele, in commending Harry Gwala, talked about how they decimated Black consciousness. To our credit, we appealed to the ANC leadership, saying, if you do recruitment across political lines, what you do is you weaken all of us in prison. We know that there will be some people who will cross, but to actively recruit is going to allow the Boers to divide and rule us. All of that fell on deaf ears until the ANC succeeded in recruiting a significant percentage of Black consciousness adherents to their ranks. Interestingly, at the point that we had suspended Lekota, Walter Sisulu, who was the liaison, organizations had their liaison to each organization. And Old Man Walter was the liaison to us. I was the representative to the ANC. And he said to me, man, if you suspend this fellow, you are allowing the enemy to divide you. You should rethink that. Of course, a couple of weeks later, he comes back and tells us, Lekota has applied and we have decided to accept him. And so the rest is history. Lekota was used very effectively to recruit from Black consciousness ranks. One of the questions raised by you out there is what he raised about Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, let's say right at the outset that all of us who were detained made different kinds of statements. And I myself know I made at least 3, probably 4 statements, because when you wrote the first statement, you said, my name is so-and-so, I was born in this place, I was born, and they'll come and say, twak, they prat stof, and dismiss that, make a show of tearing up the statement. And then you say, what must I write? Jy weet mos, jy moet skryf. And so each iteration meant you would be telling them about yourself, but also they wanted to see who else was involved. Now, one thing I want to point out during this trial, and 2 years ago, Bani Pichana, on the occasion of the testimony of Steve Biko being launched in the country, said, unlike other liberation organizations, there were never Mr. X's or Mr. Y's in any of our trials. We acknowledged what we did. Those who testified to the point of even selling out, but we did not become Mr. X roving witnesses against each other. Now that's very important to remember, because Mandela always said to us, and KK will remember this, he would always tell us, our organizations have been infiltrated. And we know that. Our organizations cannot fight a system as rabid as the racist one and expect not to have infiltration. So some of those issues are important to just place on the table. There are a few other questions about the quarry and why. The questions are: tourists are shown the lime quarry during the drive around Robben Island and told about how the older prisoners worked crushing stones. Did we work at the quarry? And I think both Nef and KK can answer that further, but because we did work in the quarry, and I'm going to ask them to just talk about it. And I think, Nef, you should mention how these guys set dogs on you and butted you with a R1 rifle because we refused their conditions in the quarry. Over to you, Nef.
Yeah, no, indeed, we worked at the quarry, and there were instances where we didn't agree with what they wanted us to do at the quarry, and KK has mentioned the instances, but there was a time when we completely refused to toe the line, and as usual, the warders would use dogs on us, and I was the one who bore the brunt of the dog. And later, I laid a charge against the warder, but the case was never attended to. Safe to say that later the warder was transferred somewhere because he was no longer working at the island. But that's what it is. So what the comrade said is raising is that at one stage or the other, there has to be a change of narrative on Robben Island. Because the narrative there, it's given as if it is a narrative of only prisoners of the ANC, and the rest of the prisoners are not part of the narrative. So even the quarry, the narrative will talk about the 1960s, when the older prisoners went there of the PAC and the ANC. So the narrative has to change because we were the cause of stopping any work whatsoever at the quarry. We are the people who made sure that political prisoners would not continue to work at the quarry or to work at all. And so we were responsible for stopping any type of work at the quarry. So that's a very important. But on a lighter note, when we arrived there, we all of a sudden got to be told that even the food that we were going to receive, there was food for the Indirs and the food for the Clearlenge and the food for the Bantus. So food would come in that fashion. If it is breakfast, there will be breakfast for the Indirs and the breakfast for the Clearlenge. And we started fighting with the system again on this way of looking at the food of the people. And what we did in defiance is that food will come in the portions that are meant for the different, what they call the different racial groups. And we will take the food and mix it and eat together if we are outside. But if we are not outside, well, bad luck, because they will bring it into your cell And in that case, you are not able to do anything. But we started fighting the question of food discrimination and food being given in that way, because we didn't believe in such kind of things. The other thing that I think is just in a way, it's a question of studies. They decided that all people who had gone into prison during our time, that 1976 onward, and who had passed matric will not study, finish and clear. And that only those who came to prison who didn't have matric were going to be allowed to study. And we had to fight again that war, together with the International Red Cross. And so some of the guys who went to prison and came out without attaining any degrees and or going any further, it was as a result of the fact that the system, Kruger in particular, had decided that no further studies will take place in prison. Because, as you know, they were abiding by the Verwoerd dictum, which says black people were not supposed to be given sufficient education because they wouldn't use it anyway. Now, I just felt that that little part of the story should also be told.
Can I just add something very significant? That the entire prison was allowed to study, and the SASO BPC Trialists from 78 were refused studies. Now, our position, and you know, some of the questions have raised the issue of resistance. Our position was in 77, and we, you know, all of us were university students. We had been in university or had just completed, like Aubrey. Aubrey had been admitted as a medical doctor. So we weren't amongst, you know, the lesser intellectually endowed. And we prepared very well, and we submitted assignments and stuff like that. But at the end, in October 77, we amongst ourselves said, you know, outside, there is still a boycott of education. How do we sit in prison in all conscience and carry on blissfully as if the struggle is not continuing outside? We're gaining degrees, we're going to finish courses. Can we do that? And unanimously, we decided, well, you know, we prepared, but let's not write. So we didn't write the exams. The following year, as a clear desire to separate us from the rest, they refused studies. Even when judges, Leonora van der Heeven came in, and the minister at the time, the guy responsible for the Schlebusch, he was the minister who came in there. We asked him about studies. In that section, he said to me, can you finish? Can you write and finish? I said, no, it's not about me. It's about all of us. So, well, it's a pity, because if you said you were going to do it, I will give you the permission right now. But that was the camaraderie that we had in our approach to the prison. We did not have a personal approach to the warders. We adopted a collective response to the warders and kept it at that. I think it's also important to say that most of the time, we were never addressed by our first names. We were always addressed by surnames. Unlike other prisoners where there was a familiarity, you know. I don't know if any of my comrades here now can attest to them having being on first name terms with the Boers in prison. I'll give you one incident where the deputy commissioner of prisons, he was in charge of political prisoners, General Yanni Roux. He had visited Robben Island and had krewe and red wine and whatever else. And for dessert, they decided to come and ask for klagtes and versoeke. Come and ask us, do we have any complaints and requests to make to the general? And of course, I think Sedibe's cell was in the front, and he said, "No, just don't lock the door, don't bother me." And a few of us went to the office. I arrived there with Muntu there, Strini was there, and Aubrey was there. So there's this intense discussion happening. And Roo was a very short guy. He had his feet over the desk, and he was smoking a cheroot. So around him was this puff of tobacco smoke. And Aubrey was intense and speaking to this man. So I asked Muntu, what's up? So Muntu says, no, Aubrey is raising that he's a medical doctor, but the hospital staff are still treating him like a bandit. They don't treat him with that knowledge that he has as a medical doctor. So this continues, and then I interrupt. I say, excuse me, General. If Aubrey could have killed me, he would have on that day. I said, you know, some of us didn't do Afrikaans in school, but we learned Afrikaans in prison. So let me tell you some of the words I've learned in prison. Your massa moor, your sissies and nutplek. Immediately, the puff of smoke, the cheroot dropped, and he sat up and said, from now, warders will have name tags. You will not use hey, you will call the prisoner by their name, and so on. So that's the kind of attitude we adopted. We did not ever have a cap in hand attitude to these guys. They would always say in the general sections, you must remove your cap before you take your food. And you were taking your food from a hatch or given by a fellow prisoner. But there was this attempt to make us compliant. And of course, many of our guys refused to do that. One of those guys was Subusiso Mabaso. And Mandela details that in his book, in Long Walk to Freedom. He says he was called by the warders to speak to Subusiso, and he realized very quickly that if he attempted to do that, Subusiso would regard him as a sellout. So he doesn't raise the issue. So it's things like that that happen, which show that from our side, we were not in a position of being in a reverie, in a, biding our time. This was struggle, but struggle that we had to prosecute on the best terms that we could. And that's why we looked for any opportunity to hit them with their own regulations. When the incidents that Nef and KK spoke about after the quarry, and we were charged with refusing a lawful command, refusing to work in the quarry, creating unrest in the prison amongst prisoners, we refused to even participate in some of the processes there. And we took the risk of asking a magistrate to try us, knowing that if we were convicted on each count, we could have had 3 months added to our sentence. But KK gave you the responses. And at no point did we ever drop our guard about what our condition was. Those were not our friends. This was a struggle, and we continued that struggle. Now, I noticed that there are a few questions here about when did we hear of Steve Biko's death? And also some dealing with Lekota. Let me just say that in September, it would have been a couple of days after Steve was murdered, Dalla Omar was our attorney because Shan Chetty was denied access to us. Dalla Omar asked to visit, and he asked to visit, me, it was refused, asked to visit, Muntu was refused. He went to the third accused and Terra, they agreed. So Terra comes back that afternoon and says to us they've killed Steve. Steve's died in prison. And that was a moment when all of us just went silent. Because if you follow the SASO BPC trial, if you follow what the state alleged against us, none of us identified anybody else but our own activities. And indeed, Steve, while some of us knew he was Frank Talk, we just said, look, that's a pseudonym. They would beat the hell out of you. Pseudo what? And you say, well, you know, it's another name. And Strini was beaten. They said, you, the editor of the newsletter. Strini acknowledged he was Frank Talk. Strini could have easily said, you know, I'm the editor, Steve was the writer. So in that famous repartee between the prosecutor, Atwell, the junior prosecutor, and Steve, Steve says, this is my writing. Well, actually, Sogot was leading him in evidence, sorry. And the judge says to the Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Rees, I thought it's accused number 9, meaning Strini. And Steve says, no, all those writings that you've charged him with are mine. But because of the dictum of common purpose, just by association and holding office, you got convicted of this. So that was the state of play. They wanted to lock all of us up, and if they could throw the key away, they would have done so. Now, there's a question about the physical encounter with Muntu Myeza. This never happened in Robben Island. There was a fisticuff in Pretoria prison, but it didn't happen in Robben Island. Lekota tended to get into scraps with almost all the accused for one reason or the other. But there was no physical fight in Robben Island between Muntu and Lekota. He was somebody who was very restless and did certain things which violated some of the security because of communications with our fellow comrades in other sections. And the Namibians complained to us. And we took that up, he denied it, and then continued doing it. And for other reasons, we decided it's about time. I think the accused now had Lekota fatigue. So we decided we need to rid ourselves of this fellow. And the rest is, as they say, history. Anything you want to add, KK?
On the question of studies, yeah, you have already really covered it. When we came on Robben Island, they said we could, in 1977, guys, you could do anything, but we have cancelled law studies. But then our group was never really allowed, although everything got cancelled, but that already had been cancelled already for us. And then Nchaupe as well was refused permission to work in the hospital. In spite of the little talk he must have had with that RU director of head of prisons, Nchaupe actually was refused permission in spite of the fact that he's a medical doctor, qualified medical doctor. He was refused permission to work in the hospital and made use of his skills and expertise to help his fellow prisoners. When we were before really forcing the system to close up the quarry, the fights, little fights between us and the warders was always there. There was this instance, for instance, when one of the prisoners would be given the food, the lunchbox to be carried by one of the prisoners for the warders. And we said to the warder, nobody is going to carry your lunchbox. You must carry it yourself. And then really you could see that really we were slowly getting the waters to where we wanted, and he started carrying his box of lunch to the lime quarry. The other point I needed to make is this. We generally, the Traphoyers and we didn't have a very good contact with family outside. We had family contacts very late on, and this really is something that was organized by Tom Mantata, who we just buried last week. And really, may his soul rest in peace. He did so much for us in terms of organizing our people to come and visit us.
Good.
Yes, I think not knowing, there isn't much more really one could add from all the points. Otherwise, we would be repeating this and that and that. Thank you.
I should just point something out. There have been a few questions also from Sam asking about the records. The best place for the records of our trial is the WITS online system. And what we'll do is we'll give that reference to the Limpopo leadership to share with others. And those of you who want it can easily email, and we'll send you those. It gives you almost entirely the court records, which are lodged at WITS. On another note, I should just say that the stubbornness that all of you know Zithulele Cindi for having was something that was legion. And in prison, what Zithulele would do is he would take the puzamandla, add some crust of bread, allow it to ferment, and you would make a maheu from it. The next day you would have a sort of sour porridgey kind of mixture. And for Madiba, you've heard that there were factions and so on. So the sticklers, the Stalinists, always said you cannot be seen to be doing certain things like making maheu yourself, because what will people say? So what he did was he relied on Zit's maheu. So when Zit made that maheu, Madiba would collect some of it and they would have their soft porridge together. Even though Madiba was, being a life prisoner, was entitled to a chunk of bread for breakfast, lunch, and supper. So Madiba was also very smart in terms of understanding young people. And the very next day that we arrived in that section, he said he wanted to make an appointment with us to discuss after the exams issues. And we said, well, let's discuss them, as they arise. And he went into a long story about, even when Zami visits. Now, I didn't know who Zami was, but realized a little later that it was Nomzamo. So even when Winnie addresses him, we address using a certain calling name or clan name. And I must say, none of us called him by Nelson, even though the warders did. We called him by Madiba or some other name, Tata, Ndate, etc. And with Zithulele is your classic polyglot. He understands every language in this country. And when he makes up his mind about something, he will not budge. So Madiba realized, here's this Zithulele who's stubborn as an ox. And there's no way that he's going to call me by a clan name because, of who Zit was. So he very cleverly called Zit Omat. And Zit in turn called him Omat. So they called each other Omat, Omat, which precluded Madiba from having the ignominy of some other name being used. But I'm sure Zit was not going to use his first name. He would have used a avuncular or paternal name, you know. But it tells you the kinds of testy relationships and sometimes the understanding of where some of us came from. So, comrades, friends, everybody who's been on this line, we've stepped way over time. And I want to express thanks to all of you for sharing your time on a Sunday afternoon when you can have better things to do, to listen to some of our Robben Island stories. I should just caution, in putting it in English, we sometimes reduce the severity of what happened. Nef, for instance, did not mention that they were locked up in a single cell section, tear gassed and bait charged in that section. Now, those kinds of things happen. And the traumas experienced by all of us have been quite deep. But immediately we came out of prison, we continued with the struggle. And here we are again, giving you some insights, and sometimes with memory fading or trying to reduce the sheer horror. Because many of our own children, many of our families have not shared the brutality that we experienced. And perhaps it is time that we actually did open up and share with all of you the terrible torture, brutality, and indeed the fights we had, not only with the Boers, but with fellow freedom fighters who opened division when we needn't have had division. So go forth, be strong, take care, and let's have other discussions with other comrades sharing their experiences. Amandla.
Thank you.
Hola.
Done.